Hello everyone and welcome to the Kootneeti's YouTube channel. I am Niranjan Marjani. Today we are going to talk about Yemen. The civil war in Yemen, which is going on for more than a decade, has intensified in the past few days. Besides increasing the security concerns, the civil war has also given rise to a major humanitarian crisis with poverty and hunger increasing in the country. To tell us more about this crisis, we have with us Mr. Ibrahim Jalal, who is a research fellow with Yemen Policy Center. Mr. Ibrahim Jalal, welcome to the Kootneeti.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be with you.
So let me start by asking you a general question. For the benefit of our viewers, if you could tell us about the background of this war, which is going on for more than a decade between the Yemeni government and the coalition forces on one hand and the Houthis on the other. How did it start?
Yeah, so unpacking the conflict maybe is the easiest part. But looking how the conflict evolved is really the most complex because it keeps evolving. But if we go back a decade from now, we had, a political uprising or, the Arab Spring uprising that stretched from Tunisia through Egypt, Syria, and Libya to Yemen. And then we had, that sort of popular uprising led to a power transition through a peaceful agreement between the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, on the one hand, and his allies, and then on the other, the opposition, thus installing the vice president of Saleh as the new interim president. So at that point in time, we had a political transition to which all Yemeni parties theoretically committed to, except armed groups who were not part of the process because they were expanding at that point in time in the periphery or outside the center and the capital. So the political process continued until early 2014. We had a national dialogue conference, which hosted large segments of the Yemeni society, including actors who were not necessarily part to the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative of 2011, which basically resolved the Arab Spring uprising then, or contained it. And that process, opened up the discussion into long accumulated issues such as distribution of power, the shape of state, the Southern question, the Saada case, all of these deep-seated issues that have been accumulating for the past 3 decades. But then eventually, we also saw, while this conference was going under the UN supervision and support of the international community, and the urge of the Yemeni population from across walks of life to go into a modern Yemen that is inclusive, that is strong, that is more equitable. We saw military incursions by militias, mainly backed by Iran, and these incursions and insurgencies have been happening since 2004. And these were, limited in geographical scope. There were latent form of conflicts, but yet they threatened the stability of the regime. So by 2014, the same militias that were conducting these insurgencies, particularly the Houthis, backed by Iran, continued what they were doing throughout the period of dialogue between 2011 and 2014. And by 2014, because of the contradictions between Saleh and the opposition and the changing agenda, eventually Saleh allied with the Houthis, thus allowing them to storm the capital. And that was the coup d'etat 6 months before the intervention of the coalition in March 2015. So that's just a brief background before getting into the regionalized phase of the conflict. So we had a coup d'etat, and then we had Houthi military swaggering by the border of Saudi Arabia, which basically threatened their sense of security. And then we had the Iranians, an Iranian MP speaking that Sana'a now is a fourth capital under the control of Iran. And all of these brought a sense of Gulf insecurity, thus putting all the developments that were happening in Yemen at the fore of regional security and in March, at the request of the interim president, who was supported regionally, locally, and internationally, the coalition eventually intervened with three objectives. First, the restoration of the Yemeni government, which they initially supported as per the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative in 2011. And the second is to curb Iranian influence in Yemen. And the third is to defeat the Houthis. These were the publicly announced objectives of the coalition. 7 years on, none of these have been accomplished. In fact, we might have been a little further in the quest of attaining any of these, particularly with regards to Iran's role in Yemen. So that's just a brief overview about how we got to the intervention, because it only gets more confusing from there.
And why is there an escalation in the past few days?
Okay, so the escalation that happened in the past weeks is a continuation of a conflict in which neither party has, a military advantage, an outright military advantage. No one has won it militarily. And therefore, escalations continue to happen sporadically, on and off. And this recent escalation happened at a time when the coalition-backed forces, including the Giant forces, mainly trained and supported by the UAE, made territorial progress and recaptured 3 districts in Shabwa. These are Asailan, Bayhan, and Ain. And the strategic importance of these stems from the fact that they border Ma'rib, but they're also home to some natural resources. And because they were captured, they pushed the Houthis back from these areas, and these areas were captured in the past year, just in recent months. And that particularly shaked the Houthi conception that they could go and move forward and when they were militarily, because they've been fighting a war in Ma'rib, and Ma'rib is the last government stronghold in the northeast of Yemen. And the Houthi strategy was one of encirclement. So they've been encircling it from Al-Bayda Governorate, and then they wanted to encircle it also from Shabwa's southwestern provinces, and then Ma'rib's southern front. So they wanted to encircle Ma'rib to have access to its natural resources eventually. And the second reason behind these escalations, of course, these attacks do not go uncoordinated with Iran, who's been financially, militarily, logistically, and politically supportive of its transnational network of militias across the region, or paramilitaries, or hybrid actors, if you will. So Iran has been also attempted through these transnational networks to show Gulf countries their strategic vulnerabilities in facing these. In countries like the UAE, whose geography is relatively small when you compare it to Saudi Arabia or even Yemen or Oman, and its economy is digitalized and diversified, and has somehow shifted from the only oil economy, but it's also a hub for investment and financial trade in the region. So with that comes just more vulnerabilities. And if you attack and send signals, then you're sending messages for them to accommodate your interest in strategic sense. So in this context, the Houthis are a pawn in the Iranians' game of pushing their interest in the region the way they want them to be, in a strategic sense and not tactical. So these 2 reasons are internal and external to why we saw the recent escalation in Yemen.
The UAE was supposed to withdraw its forces from the war, but now following the drone attacks, will it reconsider its stance and get involved again?
Well, this line is always not picked up right. The UAE never exited the war in Yemen so that it reconsiders its engagement. Yes, it has announced, its withdrawal officially, but what it did in reality was a military drawdown. and a military drawdown in the forms of downsizing its military deployment in Yemen from thousands to just a few hundreds, and then shifting its direct engagement of military presence into greater reliance on local proxies and partners that it developed and supported and financed over the past years. And this translates into just changing forms of engagement. Its logistical intelligence and air power support to the coalition hasn't ceased to exist. In fact, they were responsible for multiple high-level attacks that were launched by fire jets generally, or drones. So they have been engaged, they continue to be engaged. And what we might have seen in the past months is a concentration of its efforts in a way that focuses on the Houthis and not distract the fight against them. Because the UAE has, according to its Deputy Armed Forces Chief of Staff, 3 targets in Yemen. One, the Houthis, which comes last at this point in time, and then the Muslim Brotherhood and what they call the fifth column, and third, extremist groups in Yemen. And the latter two have seemed to occupy the great share of its concerns for the past couple of years. To see it focus back on the Houthis now, that's of course a shift, and an interesting shift, because it organizes to an extent the fight. Whether that extent is strategic will be seen in the coming days and weeks, if they would focus on recapturing other governorates such as Al Bayda, and then expanding the firefight elsewhere, maybe the vicinity of Sana'a, like where government forces were stationed a few years ago.
Now, would these recent attacks adversely impact UAE's initiatives of normalizing its ties with Iran?
I think the UAE pursues its foreign policy with ambivalence, and it sees the world as a network of interconnected spots, and that's a smart way to look at foreign policy, because smaller states have by definition strategic vulnerabilities, but a country like the UAE, who has an ample wealth, also sees the opportunities it can achieve by diversifying its relations and hedging the insecurities against the potential gains. And that's a whole different approach to foreign policy, when you realize both your limits and potential and also strategic objectives. So to answer your question, will it impact the scope of its cooperation with Iran? Iran is the big neighbor to the UAE from the other side of the region, of the Gulf region. And as much as we have Saudi Arabia to the east, to the west, we have Iran on the other side. So Iran is a reality, a geopolitical reality that the UAE cannot evade, even if Tehran occupies a few of its islands, such as Tonob and Abu Musa and etc. So for the UAE to navigate its relations, we saw it, for example, focus its statements of condemnations on the Houthis, and not point, direct fingers by merit of the highest level of foreign policy making towards Iran. And that's already a signal that the UAE understands what's happening, who's behind, and to what extent, but at the same time, there are limits to which it can go to. And the UAE, benefits from its economic ties with Iran. Iran is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, trading partners with the UAE in the region. It hosts, more than 3,000 Iranian businesses, maybe more than 8,000 Iranian traders and businessmen, and a few hundred thousands, if not even more, of Iranian residents. which is considerably the largest in the region. So there are these socioeconomic ties that go hand in hand with the security considerations that are factored in foreign policy making. And these, sort of limit what can be done as we navigate or as we see the changing security environment, because there is the threat environment, and then there is strategic and vital objectives of the Emirati foreign policy. And I reckon the Emiratis see the world as an interconnected globe where they can, hedge their bets to the fullest of their ability possible. But there are, of course, limits to what can be achievable given the high stakes at hand, especially with countries such as Iran, who are well versed and well aware of their not only strategic but grand strategic objectives.
And now coming to America's role in Yemen, Donald Trump had designated Houthis as a terror group, but Joe Biden removed that designation and also stated that ending war in Yemen is one of his foreign policy priorities. Although now he's reconsidering his decision, but how much can really the US influence this war, especially after withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is looked at as Joe Biden's foreign policy failure?
That's an interesting and a packed question, actually. But let me tackle the first bit first. The US engagement in Yemen is militarily limited to the forms of intelligence sharing, air fueling, and logistical support, with a scope of counter-terrorism units that are very small in size and work in coordination with the government of Yemen under the oversight of the vice president. So that's the scope of US engagement militarily and in security terms. In political terms, its engagement has been limited and heavily coordinated with the Arab coalition lead countries, mainly the Saudis. And we've seen in the past, for example, the initiatives when Obama was about to leave office in 2016. We had the John Kerry initiative, which was rebranding the talks of Kuwait. And that was, Obama wanted to have a last-minute legacy at that point in time, assuming there is good intention, of course. And we saw the same thing happen with the Republican president, Trump. He wanted a last-minute win after 4 years by actually designating the Houthis last minute. Although he could have done that long time ago in tandem with his, increasing efforts of pursuing the maximum pressure policy, quote unquote, on Iran. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen for another reason, that he wanted to also give a small scope of maneuvering for the next US administration. But the Biden administration has shown, perhaps passion, and in that process reflected limited understanding of the conflict itself. Because if it takes you just 1 year to really consider the FTO designation, then that's already a self sort of acknowledgement that it was a flawed decision for whatever reason, and that the foreign policy pursued was idealistic and not necessarily pragmatic. It might have been pragmatic from the perspective that the Biden administration wanted to appease or accommodate Iran by, making concessions on one of the regional files on which Iran has leverage, such as Yemen. Other files it has include Lebanon, Syria, and to some extent Iraq. So Iran is engaged in the region in multiple ways, and it would have been just one way to make that concession. And to tackle the other part of your question, of course, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, left multiple lessons for countries in conflict, or even paramilitary groups, because paramilitary groups see that they gain with time and space. The more time they have, the more space they have to develop realities on the ground, and because of the inability of whatever intervening foreign powers or coalition, then they basically, according to Henry Kissinger, if the coalition doesn't win, the insurgency doesn't lose. So they automatically win, and that gives inspiration for more paramilitaries and insurgencies in the region to stick and play against time and space. Because at some point in time, you have changes and power transitions, and with that come, changing foreign policy priorities, and the world just keeps changing. So if you domestically play against time and space, then there are chances that you could actually shape the realities on the ground. And that put just more skepticism on foreign actors, more particularly the way in which the US engages in beyond its immediate borders. Yeah.
I would also like to ask about Yemen as a part of regional and sub-regional geopolitics. One, the competition between Sunni Arab countries and Shia Iran for supremacy in the Muslim world. And two, if Yemen is a competing ground for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, since UAE supported Southern Transitional Council against Saudi Arabia-backed Hadi loyalists.
Yeah, so Yemen is the core of Gulf security from a South viewpoint. And it's true because Yemen overlooks the Red Sea on the one hand, and then the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Gulf of Aden on the other. So it's really geostrategically positioned not to only affect the Gulf region, but also the African Horn and vice versa, depending on who's stable and who's not. And it's important also for, maritime connectivity. We connect the other two ends of the world, coming from South China Sea, going to the Indian Ocean, passing by the Gulf of Aden, going all the way from the Red Sea through Suez Canal, and then all the way through the Mediterranean, and then Gibraltar. And with that comes, of course, oil and trade and all of this. And you have security concerns, piracy, counterterrorism, anti-narcotics operations. So with that consideration, Yemen is important for many reasons, depending on which actor we single out. For the Saudis, for example, we share borders, and given geographical proximity and so with Oman, then the first consideration is whether any political turmoil or conflict would be, expanding territorially and affecting their security, or whatever form of uprising would extend, such as when we had the ideational aspect of the Arab Spring uprising in 2011. But in this particular time, let's unpack it from which country's perspective, right? From the Iranian perspective, Iran has been encircling the Gulf from multiple angles. If you look at its presence in Lebanon, it has Hezbollah. If you look at it in Syria, it has multiple military regiments and its Baghdad regime. And if you look at Iraq, it has developed a large segment of militias have been heavily incorporated within Iraq's military and security infrastructure since the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And then you go to the other end of the region, and that's Yemen. So there is a strategic encirclement of the Gulf, and Iran's arch rival in the region is Saudi Arabia. So it's meant to be against Saudi Arabia, to use any of these countries to threaten the stability and security of the kingdom. And the kingdom has a religious consideration, given that it hosts the two holy mosques. So in one way, it's symbolic for the Muslim world in so many ways. And Iran, of course, has its own, theory and sect, and based on that, it sees the power structures from religious viewpoints differently. So Saudi Arabia has been always a rival for Iran, and Yemen, given what we saw in the recent years, has been, for example, a hub for Iranian-backed cross-border attacks, whether in the context of retaliation or the context of actually undermining Saudi security. So Iran is responsible in large because it's been funding and supporting the Houthis in Yemen for so long, more than a decade actually. And it might have gone back ideologically to the late 80s and early 90s. Second, if we look at the UAE has been active in the region. It has geoeconomic interests. So its strategic engagement doesn't stem from geographical proximity to Yemen as much as the Saudis or the Omanis, and the Omanis are not militarily engaged, unlike the rest of Gulf countries except Qatar, who left in 2017. So given that they don't have this geographical proximity and vital sense of national security threat from the Houthis, then what we saw in the mode of engagement is that they had, strategic interests to pursue. The geoeconomic facet is clear in Emirati foreign policy objectives in Yemen even before the intervention. So we had the port of Aden, which was leased for Dubai World for the, what they call it, Dubai Ports World, DPW, if I got it correctly. And then it was abrogated in 2012 by the Aden authorities, mainly because they saw a decrease in cargoes coming into Yemen by more than 70% from something around 500,000 cargo shipments or something into just 120, or the numbers around these estimates. So there was basically a gradual deactivation of the role of the port in favor of Jebel Ali port in the UAE. And we saw the same thing happening, for example, in Djibouti, which is why the Djibouti authorities or government eventually had abrogated some of its agreement with DPW, and then in favor of the Chinese, who eventually invested in a terminal there. So we see the geoeconomic facet in expanding the geoeconomic footprint of Abu Dhabi or Dubai or the UAE in general, and that is economically important for the UAE and understandable. But there are ways in which these could have been done differently through agreements with the government. So, and then you have the security lens, which is counter-terrorism, and that, of course, adds a lens of weaponization of threats to amplify and justify military deployments to also pursue strategic interests differently. So we saw, for example, intelligence presence under the guise of humanitarian organizations that were operating in multiple places, be it in Socotra or otherwise. And we can get two names, they're easily Googleable. So within that limit, we understand that the Emiratis have an interest in Socotra. We saw the military deployment in 2018, which Prime Minister Ahmed Ubaid bin Daghal decreed. He himself went actually there to express his opposition to that in April 2018. And then 2018, the Yemen mission at the UN Security Council issued a statement expressing its basically shock of that, because it's not an operational theater of war. It's distant by 950 kilometers from Aden, or more than 600 kilometers from other Yemeni areas where we had active military fronts. So heavy military deployment seemed like unjustifiable. So developments of military bases there to cement its military bases in the Southern Red Sea also is another strategic interest to amplify or cement its geopolitical stand. And that's basically why we saw a shift on which actors it eventually supported or created in 2016 and 17 and even 18.
With war going on between the Yemeni government and the Houthis, terror groups such as Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have been taking advantage of the situation. How serious is this challenge?
I think the biggest challenge in Yemen at the moment isn't AKAP or IS. Although these groups, use vacuum to regroup and reorganize and recruit and and ideologize people and eventually seek to expand. The biggest threat from a Yemeni security perspective, or even Gulf security perspective, or Arab security perspective, is Iran-backed militias. Because they're linked ideologically, they're transnational, and they're bound by interests that are not aligned with neither Yemeni interests, and I mean Yemeni national interests here, that benefit the population in terms of recovery, development, democratization, human progress, or even those of neighboring countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Qatar, all of these. IS and AKAP, yes, they might have expanded at one point because they tapped into this, but there are different layers of AKAP. The AKAP has been weaponized at some point to attract foreign funding and military support, and at one time it was used by other parties to show or undermine the government. So the scale of what AKAP is in Yemen, or what it looks like, is actually overshadowed by the multiple existing forms that do not actually define what AKAP is. And it is that ambiguous when we talk about, radical or extremist groups of such nature. Sometimes the threat is exaggerated, and sometimes it's undermined, and people actually in policy-making circles do not know which is which. And for them to be able to actually understand which is which, there is an emerging body of research that suggests that there is, multiple forms of the threat that they assume, and whether it is the threat that they're targeting or not, that's the question. Because if it's not, then is AKAP weaponized for further militarization and arms race and foreign intervention in a country as strategic as Yemen?
And what about the response of the United Nations? Because the United Nations Human Rights Council voted to end inquiry into the war crimes in Yemen in October 2021. Isn't the role of international agencies important, particularly since Yemen remains one of the most malnourished countries in the world?
The role of the UN generally, politically, has been mediocre, to say the least. The last political consultations, not even political negotiations or peace talks, in the sense that they talk about the conflict in a comprehensive manner, were last held in 2016. The peace talks, peace consultations in 2018, and they didn't improve the humanitarian conditions that they claimed or sought to tackle. They gave time and space for militias to expand and consolidate power, and denied the government, which they're theoretically, according to the UN charter, supposed to support in accordance with the UN responsibility in respect of sovereignty and regional and international peace and security. In terms of UN agencies working on Yemen, we've seen we've seen reports that express deep level of concern of how they work in the humanitarian sector, where the aid goes to, how much is actually being delivered to the public, and how much money is being looted or diverted or weaponized by either conflict parties generally or militias, given that the distribution of or the concentration of human aid largely flows into Houthi-held areas. And we've heard of so many reports that question the extent to which humanitarian organizations have been actually adherent by humanitarian principles: independence, impunity, humanity, and a few others. So they've not been done right. And in terms of war crimes, it is largely unfortunate that all of crimes committed by any actor, given that crime is a crime because you look at the victim and you're only supposed to be a supporter of the victim, the human being, the individual, people like us, civilians, who have nothing but, got affected by the whole situation of the conflict, is the least to establish an independent investigation committee to one, document all war crimes as a memory for future generations to look at and learn from, because the consequences have been severe. And taking into account what you mentioned about malnourishment, for example, or the scale of the humanitarian crisis, that's of course another thing to look at. These, times of darkness must be documented. They must live beyond the age that they lived, for future generations in even stable countries to look at and fear that they could go back to times of the Second World War in Europe, or even wars of American independence, or other wars in the region, be it in Southeast Asia or the Americas, or the Middle East generally, which is heavily volatile or largely volatile at the moment. And it is my hope that there will be an independent investigation committee to explore all war crimes, all violations, evaluate them independently and objectively, and eventually do the possible redress. But when I say redress, there is no redress that compensates the loss of a human life. No redress in any form in the world can replace a lost human life, can replace a lost human dear, a loved one. So that's one thing that cannot be replaced, that's gone. But what can be done is to restore the possible limit of justice and push that to the fullest limit possible, so that at least victims have ways to heal, have ways to recover, have ways to look up to life beyond the conflict they live.
Well, we certainly hope that the situation improves at the earliest. Mr. Ibrahim Jalal, thank you for your time and for speaking to the Kootneeti.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to have spoken with you.
Yeah, and it's a pleasure to talk to you as well. We hope you found this interview informative and insightful. You can tell us what you think in the comment section below, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on various social media websites, the details of which are on your screen. Thanks for watching.